A Storm of Doubt. New York, 1917. Margaret Hayes had left Sergeant Henry Whitaker's final telegram blank, unable to bring herself to write the words. But the next morning, ink stained the paper. 2 words, scrawled in shaky script, still here. Chapter 1. The telegram that wrote itself. The paper was thin, almost translucent, the color of bleached bone under the weak morning light filtering through Margaret Hayes's small New York apartment window. It crinkled slightly under her trembling fingers, the edges frayed from being handled, folded, and unfolded countless times throughout the sleepless night. Sergeant Henry Whitaker. The name, typed neatly in the upper left corner, felt like a brand, a searing reminder of the chasm that now separated her from the man she loved, a chasm carved by the brutal reality of war. She had left the telegram blank. Intentionally. It had been her last act of defiance, a futile attempt to hold onto the illusion of control in a world spinning wildly beyond her grasp. Henry had insisted, before boarding the ship that would carry him away to the battlefields of Europe, before the tight, desperate embrace that had clung to the fragile hope of return. Just a few words, Maggie. To let me know you're all right. That's all I need. But the words wouldn't come. How could she condense the tempest raging within her into a few sterile phrases? How could she tell him that all right was a concept that had ceased to exist the moment his ship disappeared over the horizon, leaving her stranded on the shores of an unbearable loneliness? She had tried. She had sat at this very desk, pen in hand, the blank telegram a mocking reflection of her own emptiness, for hours. Each attempt had ended with crumpled paper tossed into the overflowing wastebasket, a testament to her failure. Then, sometime in the pre-dawn hours, exhaustion had finally claimed her. She had slumped forward, her head resting on the cold, hard surface of the desk, the telegram still clutched in her hand. She dreamed of him, of course. She always did. Dreams of his smile, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed, the feel of his hand in hers, rough and calloused, but infinitely gentle. Dreams of the life they had planned, a life now indefinitely postponed, perhaps forever lost. When she woke, stiff and aching, the first rays of sunlight were painting the room in hues of pale gold and rose. And the telegram was no longer blank. 2 words, scrawled in a shaky, unfamiliar script, stained the paper. Still here. Margaret stared at the words, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't recognize the handwriting. It wasn't Henry's, that much was certain. His writing was bold and decisive, reflecting the unwavering strength that had always drawn her to him. This was hesitant, almost ghostly, as if the ink itself were reluctant to commit to the message. She ran a finger over the letters, the texture of the ink slightly raised, still slightly damp. It was her ink. Her pen lay on the desk, a few inches from the telegram, its nib stain the same deep, Prussian blue. She picked it up, examining it closely. There was no doubt. It was the pen she had used, or rather, tried to use, the previous night. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles turning white. Had she written it herself? In her sleep? It seemed impossible. She had no memory of it, no conscious recollection of forming the words, of guiding the pen across the paper. Yet there it was. Undeniable proof. The rational part of her brain, the part that had been meticulously trained in the scientific method during her nursing studies, screamed for a logical explanation. Sleepwalking? A momentary lapse in consciousness? But another, deeper part of her, the part that still clung to the faint hope of magic in a world increasingly devoid of it, whispered a different possibility. A possibility she didn't dare voice, even to herself. She looked around the small, sparsely furnished room, her gaze lingering on the few photographs adorning the walls. Henry, in his uniform, grinning broadly, his arms slung around her shoulders. Henry on the beach, his hair tousled by the wind, his eyes sparkling with laughter. Henry, at their favorite picnic spot in Central Park, his gaze locked on hers, filled with a love that had felt as vast and endless as the sky above. Each photograph was a shard of a broken promise, a reminder of the life they might have had. And now this telegram. This mysterious, impossible telegram. A sudden, sharp rap on the door startled her, and she jumped, nearly knocking over the inkwell. "Margaret? Are you in there?" It was Mrs. O'Malley, her landlady, her voice laced with concern. Mrs. O'Malley, a stout, Irish woman with a heart as big as her booming laugh, had become something of a surrogate mother to Margaret since Henry's departure. She worried, she fussed, she brought over extra portions of her hearty stew, and she listened, without judgment, to Margaret's anxieties and fears. Margaret hesitated, her hand still hovering over the telegram. She couldn't let Mrs. O'Malley see it. Not yet. She didn't know how to explain it, didn't even understand it herself. "Just a moment," she called out, her voice sounding strained, even to her own ears. She quickly folded the telegram, tucking it into the pocket of her apron, her heart still pounding erratically. She opened the door, forcing a smile that felt brittle and false. "Good morning, Mrs. O'Malley. Everything all right?" Mrs. O'Malley's sharp eyes scanned Margaret's face, taking in the dark circles under her eyes, the pale complexion, the lingering trace of unease. "You look like you haven't slept a wink, child. And you're as white as a sheet. Have you eaten anything?" Margaret shook her head. I wasn't hungry." Mrs. O'Malley clucked disapprovingly. "Nonsense. You need to keep your strength up. Especially now." She paused, her gaze softening. "Any word?" The unspoken question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken anxieties. "Any word from Henry?" Margaret swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. "No. Nothing." Mrs. O'Malley sighed, her ample bosom heaving. "It's the waiting, isn't it? The not knowing. That's the hardest part." She reached out and patted Margaret's hand, her touch surprisingly comforting. "He'll be all right, Margaret. He's a strong lad. And he has something to come home to." The words, meant to reassure, only served to amplify Margaret's guilt. She had sent word. Sort of. But the circumstances surrounding it were so bizarre, so inexplicable, that she couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow betrayed him. Betrayed his trust, his request for a simple, honest message. "I brought you some breakfast," Mrs. O'Malley said, breaking the silence. She held up a covered basket, the aroma of freshly baked bread and bacon wafting through the air. "Come on now. Let's get some food into you." Margaret managed a weak smile of gratitude and stepped aside to let Mrs. O'Malley enter. As the older woman bustled about, setting the table and pouring tea, Margaret's gaze drifted back to the pocket of her apron, where the telegram lay hidden. "Still here." The words echoed in her mind, a haunting, unsettling refrain. She had sent a message, but it wasn't hers. Whose was it then? And what did it mean? The question lingered, a knot of fear and uncertainty tightening in her chest, a premonition of something she could not yet comprehend, a shadow falling across the already dim light of her hope. The telegram seemed to burn a hole in her pocket, the weight of it far exceeding its few ounces of paper and ink. It was a mystery, a puzzle box, and she had a chilling premonition that opening it would change everything. Chapter 2. Whispers Across the Atlantic. The aroma of Mrs. O'Malley's breakfast, usually a welcome comfort, felt suffocating this morning. Margaret picked at the food, her appetite non-existent, her mind consumed by the enigma of the telegram. Every bite of bacon, every sip of tea, was accompanied by the phantom weight of the folded paper in her apron pocket. "You're worrying yourself sick, Margaret," Mrs. O'Malley said, her voice softening with concern. She sat opposite Margaret at the small, round table, her own plate piled high with food. "You need to distract yourself. Find something to occupy your mind." Margaret forced a smile. "I know, you're right. It's just hard. Of course it is. But dwelling on it won't bring him home any faster." Mrs. O'Malley paused, her gaze shrewd and perceptive. "You know, the hospital is always looking for volunteers, especially with so many nurses going overseas." The suggestion, though well-intentioned, sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Margaret. She had deliberately avoided any involvement with the war effort, beyond the mandatory bond drives and rationing. The thought of being surrounded by the wounded, by the constant reminders of the conflict that had stolen Henry from her, was unbearable. I don't know, Mrs. O'Malley, she stammered. I'm not sure I'm ready for that. Nonsense, the older woman said briskly. You're a trained nurse, Margaret. You have skills that are desperately needed, and it would do you good to be around people, to feel useful. Margaret knew she was right. She had spent the past few months in a self-imposed isolation, withdrawing from friends, avoiding social gatherings, her world shrinking to the confines of her small apartment. But the fear, the raw, visceral fear of facing the reality of the war, held her captive. I'll think about it, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. O'Malley, sensing her reluctance, didn't push the issue. She changed the subject, launching into a lively account of the latest gossip from the neighborhood, her words a comforting stream of normalcy in the midst of Margaret's turmoil. But even as she listened, Margaret's thoughts kept returning to the telegram. The more she considered it, the more convinced she became that she hadn't written it herself. The handwriting was too different, the feeling too alien. It was as if some unseen force had guided her hand, or perhaps, even more unsettlingly, had written the message independently, using her pen, her ink, as a conduit. The idea was preposterous, of course. She was a woman of science, of logic. She didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or automatic writing. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The telegram existed. The words were there, and she hadn't written them. After Mrs. O'Malley left, Margaret retrieved the telegram from her pocket, unfolding it once again, her fingers tracing the strange, shaky script. Still here. The words seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy, a silent hum that resonated deep within her. She decided, on a sudden impulse, to visit Dr. Alistair Fairbanks. Dr. Fairbanks was a retired physician, a former professor of hers at the nursing school, and a man known for his unconventional interests. He had a reputation for dabbling in the esoteric, for exploring the fringes of science and spirituality. He was also a kind and compassionate man, someone Margaret trusted implicitly. She found him in his cluttered study, surrounded by books and papers, the air thick with the scent of pipe tobacco and old parchment. He greeted her warmly, his eyes twinkling behind his spectacles. Margaret, my dear girl, what a pleasant surprise. To what do I owe this visit? Margaret hesitated, unsure how to begin. She felt a blush creeping up her cheeks. Dr. Fairbanks, I need your advice. About something unusual. He raised an eyebrow, his expression intrigued. Unusual? Do tell. She took a deep breath and recounted the events of the previous night, the blank telegram, the sleepless hours, the discovery of the mysterious message. She showed him the telegram, her hand trembling slightly as she held it out. Dr. Fairbanks examined it closely, his brow furrowed in concentration. He held it up to the light, scrutinizing the handwriting, the ink, the paper itself. He then looked at Margaret, his gaze piercing and insightful. You say you have no memory of writing this? None whatsoever. It's not my handwriting, Dr. Fairbanks. I'm sure of it. He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. It is curious. Very curious indeed. He paused, stroking his chin. Have you ever experienced anything like this before? Any unexplained phenomena? Margaret shook her head. No, never. I'm not prone to flights of fancy, Dr. Fairbanks. I'm a practical person. He smiled gently. Indeed, you are. But sometimes, Margaret, the world is more complex, more mysterious, than we can comprehend with our rational minds. There are forces at play that we don't fully understand. He went on to talk about the phenomenon of automatic writing, a controversial subject that had gained some attention in spiritualist circles. He explained that it was believed by some to be a form of communication with the spirit world, a way for the deceased or other entities to convey messages to the living. Margaret listened, her skepticism warring with a growing sense of unease. She didn't want to believe it. It went against everything she had been taught, everything she believed in. Yet, the evidence was there, staring her in the face. So, you think it might be Henry? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, the name a painful ache in her chest. Dr. Fairbanks shrugged. It's possible. Or it could be someone else. Someone connected to him, perhaps. Or it could be something else entirely. He didn't elaborate, but his tone suggested that the something else was not necessarily benign. He handed the telegram back to her, his expression grave. I would advise caution, Margaret. This is uncharted territory. Don't dismiss it out of hand, but don't embrace it blindly either. Keep an open mind, but be vigilant. And above all, trust your instincts. His words, though unsettling, resonated with her. She left his study feeling more confused, more frightened than ever before. But she also felt a flicker of something else. A spark of hope, perhaps. Or maybe it was just desperation. As she walked back to her apartment, the city streets bustling around her, the telegram felt like a burning coal in her pocket. Still here. The words were no longer just a mystery. They were a lifeline, a thread connecting her to something or someone beyond the veil of the known. And she knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that she had to follow that thread, no matter where it led. The feeling was almost primal, an instinct buried deep within her soul, awakened by the two strange words. It was a call, a summons, and she could no more ignore it than she could stop breathing. The wind whipped around her, carrying the sounds of the city, the distant rumble of traffic, the cries of street vendors, but all she could hear was the silent whisper of the telegram, a promise and a threat intertwined. Chapter 3. The Weight of Unsent Words. The days following Margaret's visit to Dr. Fairbanks were a blur of restless activity and gnawing anxiety. She found herself unable to shake the feeling that she was being watched, that unseen eyes were following her every move. The telegram, now tucked away in a small, locked box beneath her bed, felt like a ticking clock, counting down to some unknown event. She tried to follow Dr. Fairbanks's advice, to keep an open mind but remain vigilant. She researched automatic writing, poring over books and articles in the public library, the hushed atmosphere and the scent of old paper a strange comfort in her increasingly unsettling world. She learned about famous mediums, about seances and spirit boards, about the claims of communication with the deceased. The more she read, the more conflicted she became. Part of her, the rational, scientific part, dismissed it all as charlatanism and wishful thinking. But another part, the part that yearned for connection with Henry, that craved any shred of hope, couldn't help but wonder. She started noticing things she hadn't noticed before. Little things. A flicker of movement in the periphery of her vision. A sudden chill in the air, even on a warm day. The feeling of a presence in the room, even when she was alone. One evening, as she was preparing a meager dinner, she heard a faint tapping sound coming from the window. She turned, her heart pounding, expecting to see a bird or a branch tapping against the glass. But there was nothing there. The window was closed, the curtains drawn, the street outside quiet and deserted. She tried to dismiss it, to chalk it up to her overactive imagination. But the tapping continued, persistent and rhythmic, as if someone were trying to get her attention. She walked slowly towards the window, her hand trembling as she reached for the curtain. She pulled it back, her breath catching in her throat. There, on the outside of the window pane, etched into the condensation, were two words. The same two words. Still here. Margaret gasped, stumbling backward, her hand flying to her mouth. The words were written in a shaky, almost childlike script, identical to the writing on the telegram. They shimmered for a moment, then faded away, leaving the window pane blank once more. She stared at the empty glass, her mind reeling. This was no longer a coincidence. This was a message. A direct, undeniable message. But from whom? And why? The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface now erupted into full-blown panic. She felt trapped, suffocated, as if the walls of her small apartment were closing in on her. She had to get out. She had to escape. She grabbed her coat and hat, not bothering to lock the door behind her, and fled into the night. She walked for hours, her pace frantic, her mind racing. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away from the apartment, from the unseen presence that seemed to be haunting her. She found herself drawn to the river, the dark, swirling water reflecting the flickering gaslights along the shore. She stood on the embankment, gazing out at the vast expanse of darkness, the cold wind whipping through her hair. She thought of Henry, of his smile, his touch, his voice. She remembered the last time she had seen him, the desperate embrace, the unspoken promise. She closed her eyes, willing him to appear, to speak to her, to tell her what to do. But there was only silence. The silence of the night, the silence of the river, the silence of her own broken heart. She reached into her pocket, her fingers tracing the outline of the small, locked box containing the telegram. She pulled it out, the metal cold against her skin. She hesitated for a moment, her thumb hovering over the latch. She knew that opening the box again, reading those 2 words, would only deepen the mystery, would only draw her further into the unknown. But she couldn't resist. She had to know. She opened the box, her hand trembling so violently that she nearly dropped it. She pulled out the telegram, unfolding it carefully, her eyes scanning the familiar, yet unfamiliar, script.
Still here.
The words seemed to glow in the darkness, emanating a faint, ethereal light. And as she stared at them, she felt a sudden, sharp pain in her chest, a searing sensation that took her breath away. She gasped, clutching at her heart, her knees buckling beneath her. She felt a wave of dizziness, a sense of falling, of being pulled into a vast, swirling vortex. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the impact. But the impact never came. Instead, she felt a sensation of weightlessness, of floating, of being carried on a gentle current. She opened her eyes, her vision blurred, her senses disoriented. She was no longer standing on the riverbank. She was somewhere else. Somewhere dark and cold and damp. She could smell the scent of earth and decay, of smoke and gunpowder. She could hear the distant rumble of artillery, the cries of men, the screams of the wounded. She was in a trench, a muddy, rat-infested, blood-soaked trench. She was on the front lines. She had somehow, impossibly, been transported to the battlefields of Europe. A wave of terror washed over her, so intense that she felt paralyzed. The sounds, the smells, the sheer, overwhelming horror of it all threatened to consume her. She wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but she couldn't move. She was trapped, a helpless observer in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no awakening. The weight of unsent words, of unspoken fears, pressed down on her, heavier than any physical burden. She was drowning in a sea of sorrow and despair, the ghostly echo of still hear a cruel mockery of her own fragile existence. Chapter 4. A Nurse's Oath, a Soldier's Heart. The disorientation was profound. One moment, Margaret was on the banks of the East River, the familiar skyline of New York a distant silhouette the next. She was immersed in the chaos and squalor of a frontline trench. The air, thick with the acrid stench of cordite and the metallic tang of blood, assaulted her senses. The ground beneath her feet was a treacherous mix of mud and other things she couldn't bring herself to identify. She was dressed in her own clothes, her coat and hat woefully inadequate against the biting wind that whipped through the trench. The contrast between her civilian attire and the mud-caked uniforms of the soldiers around her was jarring, a stark reminder of her displacement. Panic clawed at her throat, threatening to overwhelm her. She wanted to scream, to run, to somehow undo this impossible journey. But her training, the ingrained discipline of a nurse, kicked in, a lifeline in the sea of her fear. Assess. Stabilize. Act. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to focus, to observe. The trench was a narrow, zigzagging ditch, reinforced with sandbags and wooden planks. Soldiers huddled together, their faces gaunt and drawn, their eyes reflecting the horrors they had witnessed. Some were wounded, their bandages stained with blood and mud. Others were simply waiting for the next shell to fall, the next attack to begin, the next moment of terror to shatter the uneasy calm. She saw a young soldier, no older than 18, lying on a makeshift stretcher, his leg mangled by shrapnel. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, his eyes glazed with pain. He was bleeding profusely. Without thinking, Margaret knelt beside him, her hands instinctively reaching for her non-existent medical bag. She realized, with a jolt of despair, that she had nothing.
No bandagens, no antiseptic, no morfine.
Nothing but her bare hands and her training. Hold on, she said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her hands.
Hold on.
I'm a nurse. I'm going to help you. The soldier looked at her, his eyes widening with a flicker of hope. He tried to speak, but only a gurgling sound escaped his lips. Margaret ripped strips of fabric from her petticoat, her movements swift and efficient. She applied a makeshift tourniquet to his leg, her fingers working quickly to stem the bleeding. She spoke to him in a soothing voice, reassuring him, telling him he was going to be all right, even though she didn't know if it was true. As she worked, she became aware of the stares of the other soldiers. They watched her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. A woman in the trenches was an anomaly, a breach of protocol, a distraction from the grim reality of their existence. A gruff voice broke through the silence. What the hell are you doing here? Margaret looked up, her gaze meeting that of a hardened sergeant, his face weathered and scarred, his eyes cold and unforgiving. He was the embodiment of war, of the brutal, unforgiving nature of this conflict. I'm a nurse, she said, her voice firm, despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. This man is injured. He needs help. The sergeant scowled. This ain't no place for a woman. Get out of here, before you get yourself killed. I'm not leaving, Margaret said, her voice rising slightly. I took an oath. I'm here to help. The sergeant stared at her, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be weighing her words, assessing her sincerity. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. All right, nurse. Do what you can, but stay out of the way. And don't expect any favors. He turned and barked orders at his men, his voice harsh and commanding. The soldiers, their attention diverted, returned to their duties, their movements mechanical and practiced. Margaret continued to work on the wounded soldier, her hands moving with a skill and precision that belied her fear. She cleaned his wound, bandaged it as best she could, and made him as comfortable as possible. She spoke to him softly, offering words of comfort and encouragement, her voice a beacon of hope in the darkness of the trench. As she worked, she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The fear hadn't disappeared entirely, but it was overshadowed by a sense of purpose, a feeling that she was where she was supposed to be, doing what she was meant to do. She realized, with a sudden clarity, that this was what Henry had been trying to tell her. Still here. He wasn't just referring to his physical presence on the battlefield. He was referring to his spirit, his essence, his unwavering commitment to duty and compassion. And now, somehow, she was sharing that experience, that burden, that profound sense of connection. Hours passed, marked only by the changing light and the sporadic bursts of gunfire. Margaret moved from soldier to soldier, tending to their wounds, offering words of comfort, her presence a small but significant source of solace in the midst of the carnage. She saw things that would haunt her nightmares for years to come, but she didn't flinch. She didn't falter. She held onto her training, her oath, her newfound understanding of Henry's reality. As darkness fell, the fighting intensified. Shells rained down on the trench, the explosions shaking the ground, sending showers of mud and debris raining down on them. Margaret huddled in a corner, her body trembling, her ears ringing. She closed her eyes, praying for it to end, praying for Henry, praying for herself. Then, she felt a hand on her shoulder, a firm, reassuring grip. She opened her eyes, her gaze meeting that of the sergeant, his face illuminated by the flickering light of a nearby lantern. It's going to be a long night, nurse, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. But we'll get through it. Together. His words, simple and direct, offered a glimmer of hope in the overwhelming darkness. Margaret nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She looked at the sergeant, at the soldiers around her, at the wounded she had tended to. She was no longer an outsider, a stranger in a strange land. She was one of them, bound by duty, by compassion, by the shared experience of war. And in that moment she understood. She was still here. They were all still here. And somehow that was enough. The shared experience, the unspoken understanding, created a bond stronger than any she had ever known. It was a connection forged in the crucible of war, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Chapter 5. Echoes of the Front Line. The night stretched on, an eternity of noise and fear. The shelling continued relentlessly, each explosion a hammer blow against Margaret's frayed nerves. She moved through the trench, checking on the wounded, offering what little comfort she could. The sergeant, whose name she learned was Miller, kept a watchful eye on her, his gruff exterior softening slightly as he witnessed her unwavering dedication. She found herself thinking of Henry constantly, wondering where he was, if he was safe, if he was thinking of her. The "still here" message echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of their connection, a fragile thread linking her to him across the miles and the madness. She noticed that the soldiers, initially wary of her presence, were beginning to accept her. They offered her sips of water from their canteens, shared their meager rations, even managed a few hesitant smiles. They called her Nurse Maggie, a term of endearment that warmed her heart, a small spark of humanity in the dehumanizing landscape of war. As the night wore on, the shelling began to subside. A fragile silence descended upon the trench, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the ragged breathing of exhausted men. Margaret sat beside the young soldier she had treated earlier, his condition still precarious. She held his hand, her touch gentle and reassuring. "You're going to be all right," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You're strong. You'll make it." The soldier squeezed her hand weakly, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at her, his gaze filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. "Thank you, Nurse Maggie," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Thank you for everything." His words, simple and heartfelt, brought tears to Margaret's eyes. She realized that she had made a difference, that her presence here, however improbable, had mattered. She had offered comfort, she had eased suffering, she had embodied hope in a place where hope was a rare and precious commodity. Suddenly, a commotion erupted at the far end of the trench. Shouts and cries filled the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of gunfire, closer now, more intense.
Attack.
Someone yelled, "They're coming!" Panic surged through the trench. Soldiers scrambled to their positions, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Sergeant Miller barked orders, his voice harsh and commanding. "Get down, Nurse Maggie," he shouted, pushing her towards a sheltered corner of the trench. "Stay down and stay out of sight." Margaret obeyed, crouching low, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the sounds of battle raging around her, the screams of men, the crackle of gunfire, the terrifying whistle of incoming shells. She closed her eyes, her mind racing. She thought of Henry, of the danger he faced every day, of the constant threat of death that hung over him. She prayed for his safety, for his return, for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. Then she heard a different sound, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, beneath the din of battle. It was a voice, a familiar voice, calling her name. "Maggie? Maggie." She opened her eyes, her heart leaping into her throat. She looked around, her gaze searching the darkness. She saw nothing but shadows and movement, the silhouettes of soldiers fighting and dying. "Maggie, where are you?" The voice was closer now, clearer. It was Henry's voice. She was sure of it. But how could it be? He was miles away, across the ocean, in a different part of the front line. It was impossible. Yet, she couldn't deny what she heard. She stood up, ignoring Sergeant Miller's shouted warnings, her eyes scanning the trench. Henry! She cried out, her voice hoarse and desperate. Henry! I'm here.
She saw him then.
A figure emerging from the smoke and chaos, his uniform covered in mud and blood, his face grimy and exhausted, but his eyes were unmistakable. They were filled with a mixture of shock and relief, of love and desperation. It was Henry. He was here, in the same trench. Against all odds, against all reason, they had found each other. He rushed towards her, his arms outstretched, his face a mask of disbelief. Margaret ran to meet him, her heart soaring with a joy so intense it was almost painful. They collided in a fierce embrace, their bodies clinging together, their hearts beating as one. The world around them, the war, the noise, the danger, faded away. There was only them, reunited in the most improbable of circumstances, their love a beacon in the darkness. Maggie, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. How is this possible? I don't know, she said, her voice trembling. I don't understand it. But I'm here. We're together. He held her tight, his face buried in her hair, his body shaking with sobs. She could feel the wetness of his tears on her neck, the tremors of his body against hers. The reality of their situation, the sheer impossibility of their reunion, began to sink in. It was a miracle, a twist of fate, a defiance of all logic and reason. But it was also a fleeting moment, a fragile bubble of happiness in a world of chaos and destruction. They both knew that it couldn't last, that the war would soon intrude, that they would be forced to face the reality of their situation. But for now, for this brief, precious moment, they were together. And that was all that mattered. The echoes of the front line faded into the background, replaced by the sound of their shared breaths, their whispered words of love, their desperate, clinging embrace. It was a moment suspended in time, a testament to the enduring power of love in the face of unimaginable adversity. Chapter 6. The Dance of Duty and Desire. Their reunion, as miraculous as it was quickly overshadowed by the harsh realities of their surroundings. The attack continued, the sounds of battle growing closer, more intense. Henry, his initial shock giving way to his ingrained soldier's instincts, pulled Margaret back towards the relative safety of the trench wall. We have to get you out of here, Maggie, he said, his voice urgent, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene. This is no place for you. Margaret shook her head, her gaze locked on his. I'm not leaving you, Henry. Not again. He stared at her, his expression a mixture of love and frustration. Maggie, be reasonable. This is too dangerous. I can't risk losing you again. And I can't risk losing you, she retorted, her voice firm. I'm a nurse, Henry. I can help. I have been helping. He saw the determination in her eyes, the unwavering resolve that mirrored his own. He knew she wouldn't be swayed. He also knew, deep down, that she was right. She had skills that were desperately needed, skills that could save lives. He sighed, running a hand through his mud-caked hair. All right, Maggie. But you stay close to me. And you do exactly as I say. Understand? She nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and fear. She knew he was putting his own safety at risk by allowing her to stay, but she also knew that she couldn't bear to be separated from him again, not after finding him in this impossible way. They moved together through the trench, Henry shielding her with his body as they navigated the chaos. The fighting was fierce, hand-to-hand combat in some places, the air thick with the screams of men and the metallic clang of weapons. Margaret saw Sergeant Miller, his face grim, his rifle firing steadily. He caught her eye and nodded, a flicker of respect in his gaze. He had witnessed her bravery, her unwavering commitment to the wounded, and he knew she was an asset, not a liability. Henry led her to a relatively sheltered area, a small alcove carved into the side of the trench. He positioned her there, his body acting as a shield against flying debris. Stay here, he said, his voice low and urgent. I'll be back as soon as I can. He disappeared back into the fray, his rifle at the ready, his movements swift and decisive. Margaret watched him go, her heart in her throat, her fear for his safety overwhelming. She forced herself to focus, to remember her training. She checked the supplies she had managed to gather, the meager bandages and antiseptic she had scavenged from abandoned medical kits. She knew she had to be ready to help, to tend to the wounded, as soon as the opportunity arose. The fighting continued for what seemed like an eternity. Margaret huddled in the alcove, her senses on high alert, her ears straining to hear Henry's voice above the din of battle. She prayed for his safety, for the safety of all the men around her, for an end to the madness. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fighting subsided. A hush fell over the trench, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the ragged breathing of exhausted men. Margaret emerged from the alcove, her eyes searching the scene. The trench was a scene of devastation, littered with bodies and debris. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of death. She saw Henry then, his uniform torn and blood-stained, his face grimy and exhausted, but his eyes were filled with relief. He was alive. He was safe. He rushed towards her, his arms outstretched, and they embraced, their bodies clinging together, their hearts pounding in unison. "It's over," he whispered, his voice hoarse.
For now.
They stood there for a moment, their bodies intertwined, their love a fragile shield against the horrors they had witnessed. Then they got to work. Together, they moved through the trench, tending to the wounded, offering comfort and care. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized, their skills complementing each other. They were a team, a unit, bound together by love and duty. As they worked, they talked, their voices low, their words filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. They shared their experiences, their fears, their hopes. They spoke of the future, of the life they dreamed of, a life beyond the war, a life of peace and happiness. But even as they spoke of the future, they knew that the present was precarious, that the war was far from over. They were dancing on the edge of a knife, their love a fragile flame in the darkness, their duty a constant reminder of the dangers they faced. It was a delicate balance, a dance between desire and duty, between hope and despair. And they knew that they had to navigate it carefully, step by careful step, if they were to survive. The weight of the war pressed down on them, but their love, their shared commitment, gave them the strength to carry on. They were two souls, intertwined by fate, battling the darkness together, their hearts beating as one. Chapter 7. Scars Beneath the Surface. The aftermath of the attack left the trench a scene of quiet devastation. The adrenaline of battle had faded, replaced by the exhaustion of survival and the grim reality of loss. Margaret and Henry worked tirelessly, tending to the wounded, their hands moving with practiced efficiency, their hearts heavy with sorrow. They didn't speak much, their communication a silent understanding forged in the crucible of shared experience. They knew the fragility of their situation, the precariousness of their reunion. Any moment could bring another attack, another separation, another heartbreak. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of pale gray and pink, a semblance of order returned to the trench. The wounded were being evacuated, the dead were being collected, and the remaining soldiers were beginning to regroup. Margaret and Henry found a quiet corner, away from the immediate activity, and sat down, their bodies aching, their minds numb. They leaned against each other, seeking comfort in the warmth of their shared presence. How did you find me?" Margaret asked, her voice finally breaking the silence. Henry looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and disbelief.
"I don't know, Maggie."
"I honestly don't know. I heard your voice, I had to find you." He recounted his experience, how he had been in a different sector of the front line, miles away, when he had heard her calling his name. He had dismissed it at first, thinking it was a hallucination, a cruel trick of his exhausted mind. But the voice had persisted, growing louder, more insistent, until he could no longer ignore it. He had followed the voice, driven by an instinct he couldn't explain, navigating the treacherous landscape of the battlefield, defying orders, risking his own life. He had found his way to this trench, to this very spot, led by a force he didn't understand. Margaret listened, her heart aching with the knowledge of the risks he had taken, the dangers he had faced, to find her. She realized that their connection, their love, was something beyond the realm of logic, something that defied explanation. "It was the telegram," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The message. She told him about the mysterious writing, about her visit to Dr. Fairbanks, about the strange occurrences that had led her to this very place. Henry listened, his expression a mixture of skepticism and awe. He was a soldier, a man of action, not a believer in the supernatural. But he couldn't deny the evidence, the reality of their reunion, the impossible circumstances that had brought them together. "I don't understand it, Maggie," he said, shaking his head. "But I believe you. I have to." They sat in silence for a moment, their thoughts swirling, their emotions raw. The scars of war, both visible and invisible, were etched deep within them. They had seen too much, experienced too much, to ever be the same. Margaret looked at Henry, at the lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, at the mud and blood staining his uniform, at the haunted look in his gaze. She saw the man she loved, but she also saw the soldier, the warrior, the survivor. She knew that he carried burdens she couldn't fully comprehend, that he had witnessed horrors she could only imagine. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. His hand was rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle, reassuring. "We'll get through this, Henry," she said, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "Together. We'll face whatever comes. We have to." He squeezed her hand, his eyes meeting hers. He saw the determination in her gaze, the unwavering love that shone through the darkness. He knew that she was his anchor, his lifeline, his reason to keep fighting. "I know," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I know we will." They sat there, hand in hand, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its pale light on the ravaged landscape. The echoes of battle still lingered, the scars of war remained, but in their shared silence, in their unspoken understanding, they found a fragile peace, a glimmer of hope in the midst of despair. They knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were together. And for now, that was enough. They were two souls, scarred but not broken, their love a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. They had found each other in the heart of darkness, and they would face the future, whatever it held, hand in hand. The scars beneath the surface were a reminder of the battles fought, the losses endured, but they were also a symbol of their resilience, their unwavering commitment to each other, and their enduring love. Chapter 8. Letters from a Stranger. Days turned into weeks, and Margaret and Henry settled into a precarious routine within the confines of the trench. The constant threat of danger was a backdrop to their every interaction, a chilling reminder of the war that raged around them. Yet, within this brutal reality, they carved out moments of shared tenderness, stolen glances, whispered words, a silent language of love spoken in the midst of chaos. Margaret continued her work as a nurse, her skills and compassion earning her the respect of the soldiers and the grudging admiration of Sergeant Miller. She became known as Angel Maggie, a beacon of hope in the grim landscape of the front line. Henry, meanwhile, fought with a renewed sense of purpose, his love for Margaret a driving force, a shield against the despair that threatened to consume him. One evening, after a relatively quiet day, Henry returned to their shared alcove, his face unusually pale, his hands trembling slightly. He held a small, crumpled packet of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. "These were found on a captured German officer," he said, his voice hesitant, his eyes avoiding Margaret's gaze. "They're there in English." Margaret looked at the letters, her curiosity piqued. She took them from him, her fingers gently untying the ribbon. The paper was thin and yellowed, the ink faded, but the handwriting was clear and elegant. As she began to read, a strange feeling washed over her. The letters were addressed to a woman named Elise, and they were filled with expressions of love, longing, and despair. The writer spoke of his longing for home, his hatred of the war, his dreams of a future that seemed increasingly unlikely. But it wasn't the content of the letters that struck Margaret. It was the tone, the voice, the feeling that emanated from the words. It was familiar.
Uncannily familiar.
She continued to read, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She recognized phrases, sentiments, even entire sentences that echoed her own conversations with Henry, her own unspoken fears and desires. She looked up at Henry, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Henry, these letters, they sound like..." He nodded, his expression grim. "Like they were written by me." "I know." He explained that he had read a few of the letters himself, and he had been struck by the same eerie similarity. He didn't understand it, couldn't explain it, but he couldn't deny the feeling that these letters, written by a German officer, a man he had never met, an enemy, were somehow connected to him. Margaret and Henry spent the rest of the evening poring over the letters, searching for clues, for explanations, for anything that could shed light on this strange mystery. They found no obvious connections, no shared names or places, no logical explanation for the similarities in the writing. But as they read, they began to uncover a deeper, more disturbing truth. The letters revealed a story of forbidden love, of betrayal, of a secret that had been buried for years. The German officer, whose name was Klaus, had been in love with an Englishwoman, Elise, before the war. They had met in London, where Klaus had been studying, and they had fallen deeply in love. But their relationship had been doomed from the start. Elise was engaged to another man, a wealthy and influential member of British society. Klaus was a German, an outsider, a potential enemy. They had kept their love a secret, meeting in hidden places, exchanging passionate letters, dreaming of a future they knew could never be. When the war broke out, Klaus had been forced to return to Germany, to fight for a country he no longer believed in, against a country he loved. He had continued to write to Elise, his letters filled with anguish and despair, his love for her a constant torment. The last letter in the packet was dated just a few weeks before Klaus's capture. It was a farewell letter, a final expression of his love, a resignation to his fate. He knew he was going to die, and he wanted Elise to know that he had never stopped loving her. Margaret and Henry read the final letter in silence, their hearts aching with the tragedy of Klaus's story. They realized that they were holding in their hands the remnants of a shattered life, a testament to the destructive power of war, the enduring strength of love. The mystery of the similar writing and of the connection Margaret and Henry felt to the letters remained. It served as a stark reminder of the thin lines separating enemies, the shared humanity that existed even in the midst of the brutal conflict. The letters brought an unexpected poignancy to their precarious situation. They did not know how or why, but Klaus' story felt intertwined with theirs. And they knew that this, too, was a thread they needed to follow. The war, the strange telegram, and now these letters. It was all connected somehow. Chapter 9. The Unspoken Promise. The discovery of Klaus's letters cast a long shadow over Margaret and Henry's already fragile existence. The parallels between Klaus and Elise's forbidden love and their own precarious situation were too stark to ignore. The war, the separation, the constant threat of loss, it all resonated with a chilling familiarity. They found themselves drawn to the letters, rereading them, searching for clues, for some explanation of the uncanny connection they felt to Klaus's story. They were particularly intrigued by the similarities in the writing style, the phrases and sentiments that echoed their own conversations, their own unspoken fears and desires. One evening, as they sat huddled together in their alcove, sharing a meager meal of hardtack biscuits and lukewarm tea, Margaret voiced the question that had been haunting them both. Do you think it's possible that Klaus and I that we're somehow related?" she asked, her voice hesitant, her eyes searching Henry's. Henry looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know, Maggie. It seems far-fetched, but I can't deny the feeling that there's something connecting us to a story." He recounted his own research into his family history, his efforts to trace his lineage back to Germany. He had found no direct connections, No evidence of any relatives who had emigrated to England or had any contact with a woman named Elise. Margaret, too, had delved into her own family history, poring over old letters and documents, searching for any mention of a Klaus and Elise, a connection to Germany. She had found nothing concrete, only a few vague references to distant relatives who had lived in Europe, their stories lost to time. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, they couldn't shake the feeling that Klaus's story was somehow intertwined with their own. They felt a kinship with him, a shared sense of loss and longing, a recognition of the enduring power of love in the face of adversity. One day, while cleaning a particularly nasty wound for a young soldier, Margaret had a sudden, unexpected insight. She remembered Dr. Fairbanks, his words about automatic writing, about the possibility of communication with the spirit world. She remembered the telegram, the mysterious message still here. She remembered the feeling of an unseen presence, the strange occurrences that had led her to the front lines, to Henry. Could it be possible that Klaus, in his final moments, had somehow reached out to them, had used them as a conduit to express his love for Elise, his despair at his fate? Could his spirit, his essence, be somehow connected to theirs, influencing their thoughts, their emotions, their actions? The idea was preposterous, of course. She was a nurse, a woman of science, not a believer in ghosts or spirits. But she couldn't deny the evidence, the uncanny similarities between Klaus's letters and their own experiences, the undeniable feeling of connection that she felt to his story. She shared her thoughts with Henry, her voice hesitant, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and wonder. He listened patiently, his expression skeptical, but he didn't dismiss her ideas out of hand. He had seen too much, experienced too much, to rule out any possibility, however improbable. "I don't know, Maggie," he said, shaking his head. "I don't understand it. But I trust you. If you believe there's something more to this, then I'm with you." They decided, on a shared impulse, to try to communicate with Klaus. They knew it was a long shot, a desperate attempt to find answers in a world that seemed increasingly devoid of logic and reason. They found a quiet corner of the trench, away from the prying eyes of the other soldiers. They lit a small candle, its flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the mud walls. They held hands, their fingers interlaced, their hearts beating in unison. Margaret closed her eyes, focusing her thoughts on Klaus, on his love for Elise, on his despair at his fate. She spoke softly, her voice barely a whisper, addressing the unseen presence she believed was there. "Klaus," she said, "if you can hear us, please give us a sign. Help us understand." They waited in silence, their senses on high alert, their bodies tense with anticipation. The only sound was the crackling of the candle flame, the distant rumble of artillery fire, the ragged breathing of exhausted men. At first, nothing happened. Margaret began to doubt herself, to question her sanity. She was about to give up, to dismiss the whole thing as a foolish fantasy. Then she felt it, a sudden chill in the air, a tingling sensation in her hands, a feeling of a presence in the room, close, intimate, yet unseen. She opened her eyes, her gaze meeting Henry's. He had felt it too. His eyes were wide with wonder, his face pale, his body trembling slightly. They didn't see anything, didn't hear anything, but they knew. They knew that they were not alone. They knew that Klaus was there, in some form, some essence, some way they couldn't comprehend. An unspoken promise passed between them. They would continue to search for answers. They would honor the memory of the pair. They would not let the war or anything break the bond they had now. They would continue to love, to fight, and to live, not just for themselves, but for Klaus and his lost Elise. Chapter 10. A glimpse of hope in the ruins. The confirmation of Klaus's presence, however intangible, strengthened Margaret and Henry's resolve. They continued their duties, their love for each other a shield against the constant barrage of war's horrors, but they also dedicated their precious free moments to unraveling the mystery surrounding Klaus and Elise. Sergeant Miller, initially skeptical of Margaret's unusual ways, had gradually come to accept her presence, even offering a grudging respect for her unwavering dedication to the wounded. He had witnessed the strange bond between Margaret and Henry, the silent understanding that passed between them, and he had heard the whispers about the mysterious letters. He didn't understand it, but he didn't interfere. He had seen enough strange things in this war to question the boundaries of reality. One evening, after a particularly brutal artillery barrage that had left the trench in ruins and the medical tent overflowing with wounded, Margaret found herself exhausted and despairing. She had worked tirelessly for hours, tending to injuries that seemed beyond repair, witnessing suffering that defied comprehension. She retreated to a relatively undamaged section of the trench, a small alcove where she and Henry often sought solace. She sat down, her body aching, her mind numb. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the sounds of moaning and the smell of blood. She felt a hand on her shoulder, a gentle touch that sent a wave of warmth through her. She opened her eyes and saw Henry, his face grimy and exhausted, but his eyes filled with a tenderness that always managed to reach the deepest part of her. "I brought you something," he said, his voice low and soothing. He held out a small, battered tin box. Margaret took the box, her fingers tracing the worn metal. She opened it carefully, her breath catching in her throat. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, dried flower. "A forget-me-not. I found it near the German trenches," Henry explained. "It was growing in the middle of all the destruction." It seemed a sign. Margaret looked at the flower, its delicate blue petals a stark contrast to the mud and blood that surrounded them. The forget-me-not, a symbol of remembrance, of enduring love, of a promise that would not be broken. Tears welled up in her eyes, tears of sorrow, of gratitude, of hope. She realized that even in the midst of the ruins, in the heart of darkness, there was still beauty, there was still life, there was still love. She took the flower from the box, holding it gently in her hand. She closed her eyes, inhaling its faint, sweet fragrance. She felt a sudden surge of connection to Klaus, to Elise, to all those who had loved and lost in this brutal war. She knew that their fight was far from over, that the dangers they faced were real and immediate. But she also knew that they were not alone. They had each other, they had their love, and they had the memory of Klaus and Elise, a reminder that even in the face of death, love could endure. Henry sat beside her, his arm around her, his body a warm and comforting presence. They sat in silence for a moment, their thoughts shared, their hearts connected. "We'll find her, Maggie," Henry said, his voice breaking the silence. "We'll find Elise. We'll find out what happened to her." Margaret nodded, her gaze meeting his. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that the search for Elise would likely lead them into even greater danger, into the heart of enemy territory. But she was not afraid. She had Henry by her side, and she had a purpose, a mission, a promise to fulfill. They emerged from the alcove, hand in hand, their faces resolute, their hearts filled with a fragile hope. The ruins of the trench surrounded them, a testament to the destructive power of war. But amidst the rubble and the despair, they saw a glimmer of light, a spark of beauty, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, love could bloom, like a single, defiant flower in a field of destruction. It was a glimpse of hope, a fragile promise, but it was enough. It was enough to keep them going, to keep them fighting, to keep them believing in a future beyond the war, a future where love could triumph over hate, where peace could reign over destruction. They stood together, two souls against the storm, their love a beacon in the ruins. Chapter 11. The Price of Silence. The decision to find Elise propelled Margaret and Henry into a clandestine operation, a dangerous dance of espionage and deception within the already perilous landscape of the front lines. They knew that any overt inquiries about a British woman connected to a German officer would raise immediate suspicion, potentially exposing them to accusations of treason or collaboration with the enemy. They began their search subtly, using their respective positions to gather information. Margaret, as a nurse, had access to the wounded, both Allied and German prisoners. She listened carefully to their conversations, their ramblings, their whispered secrets, hoping to glean any clue that might lead her to Elise. Henry, as a soldier, had access to intelligence reports, maps, and troop movements. He used his knowledge of the battlefield to try to pinpoint Klaus's regiment, to identify any areas where Elise might have been located. Their search was hampered by the constant chaos of war, the shifting front lines, the ever-present threat of danger. They had to be careful, discreet, their every move calculated, their every word measured. They knew that one wrong step, one misplaced trust, could cost them their lives. They developed a code, a secret language of subtle gestures and coded phrases, to communicate their findings without arousing suspicion. They used the forget-me-not as their symbol, a discreet sign of their shared mission, a reminder of their promise to Klaus and Elise. One day, while tending to a wounded German prisoner, Margaret overheard a conversation that sent a jolt of excitement through her. The prisoner, delirious with fever, was muttering about a woman, an Englishwoman, who had helped him and his comrades escape from a British prison camp. Margaret listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest. She gently probed the prisoner, asking subtle questions, trying to elicit more information without revealing her true intentions. The prisoner, in his fevered state, spoke of the woman's kindness, her bravery, her unwavering commitment to helping those in need. He mentioned her name, a name that Margaret had never heard before, but a name that resonated with a strange familiarity. Agnes, the prisoner whispered. Her name was Agnes. She was an angel of mercy. Margaret carefully noted the name, committing it to memory. She knew that this could be a crucial lead, a potential connection to Elise. But she also knew that she had to be cautious, that she couldn't jump to conclusions. She shared her discovery with Henry, her voice hushed, her eyes filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Henry listened intently, his expression thoughtful. Agnes, he repeated, his brow furrowed in concentration. It's not Elise, but it could be a connection. Perhaps a friend, a relative, a code name. They decided to investigate further, to try to find out more about this Agnes, this woman who had risked her own life to help German prisoners of war. Their investigation led them to a network of secret contacts, whispers among the wounded and weary. They learned that Agnes was a figure of legend and rumor, and they began to be convinced this was a cover name, a deliberate veil. They discovered the heavy, painful price of silence. The silence surrounding Agnes' real identity. The silence of the men who had helped her and were not dead. The silence of a network protecting a loved and valuable asset. But this would not deter them. They were close. They could feel it. The unseen hand of Klaus, perhaps, guiding them closer. They knew that the truth, like the forget-me-not, would eventually bloom, even in the darkest of places. Chapter 12. Shadows of Betrayal. Margaret and Henry's investigation into Agnes led them down a treacherous path, a labyrinth of secrets and lies, where trust was a rare commodity and betrayal lurked around every corner. They knew they were playing a dangerous game, risking exposure, imprisonment, or worse. But their determination to uncover the truth about Elise, to fulfill their unspoken promise to Klaus, fueled their resolves. Through their network of contacts, they learned that Agnes was rumored to be operating within a network of spies and sympathizers, a clandestine organization dedicated to undermining the Allied war effort. This discovery sent a chill down Margaret's spine. If Agnes was indeed connected to Elise, it could mean that Elise herself was involved in espionage, a traitor to her own country. The thought was deeply unsettling. Margaret had always believed in the inherent goodness of people, in the power of love and compassion to transcend national boundaries. The idea that Elise, the woman Klaus had loved so deeply, could be involved in such a betrayal was difficult to comprehend. Henry, however, remained pragmatic. He was a soldier, trained to recognize the complexities of war, the blurred lines between right and wrong, the compromises that people made in the name of survival or ideology. He knew that Elise's actions, whatever they may be, had to be viewed within the context of the times, the pressure she faced, the choices she had been forced to make. "We can't judge her, Maggie," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We don't know the full story. We don't know what she's been through. Margaret nodded, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She knew Henry was right, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the shadow of doubt that had fallen over Elise's memory. Their investigation continued, leading them closer to the heart of the spy network. They learned that Agnes was a skilled operative, known for her cunning, her bravery, and her unwavering commitment to her cause. She was a master of disguise, a chameleon who could blend seamlessly into any environment, a ghost who left no trace. One evening, while searching through a collection of captured documents, Henry stumbled upon a coded message that mentioned Agnes by name. The message was intercepted by British intelligence, and it detailed a planned rendezvous between Agnes and a high-ranking German officer. The location of the rendezvous was a small, abandoned church on the outskirts of a nearby village. Henry and Margaret knew that this was their chance. They had to intercept Agnes, to confront her, to find out the truth about her connection to Elise. They devised a plan, a risky and daring operation that could expose them to extreme danger. They would pose as sympathizers, infiltrate the rendezvous, and attempt to extract information from Agnes. They knew that they were walking into a trap, that the chances of success were slim. But they were prepared to take the risk. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to turn back now. As they prepared for their mission, Margaret felt a growing sense of dread, a premonition of impending doom. She looked at Henry, his face determined, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and apprehension. She knew that this could be their last mission together, that they might not both survive. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "Be careful, Henry," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Please be careful." He squeezed her hand, his eyes meeting hers. He saw the fear in her gaze, the unspoken plea that mirrored his own. "I will, Maggie," he said, his voice firm. "I promise. We'll get through this. Together." They embraced, their bodies clinging together, their hearts beating as one. It was a moment of shared vulnerability, a silent acknowledgement of the dangers they faced, a reaffirmation of their unwavering love. The shadows of betrayal loomed large, but their love, their shared purpose, shone like a beacon in the darkness. They were prepared to face the unknown, to confront the shadows, to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Chapter 13.
Stulen moments, stuleng glansas.
The journey to the abandoned church was fraught with tension. Margaret and Henry, disguised as local villagers, navigated the war-torn countryside, their senses on high alert, their every move calculated. The landscape was scarred by battle, the fields churned into mud, the trees stripped bare, the air thick with the smell of decay. They reached the church as dusk was settling, the sky a canvas of deep purple and fading orange. The building was a crumbling shell, its roof partially collapsed, its windows shattered, its stone walls scarred by shrapnel. It was a desolate, eerie place, a fitting setting for a clandestine rendezvous. They concealed themselves in the shadows, their hearts pounding in their chests, their eyes scanning the surroundings. They waited, their patience tested by the growing darkness and the chilling silence. After what seemed like an eternity, they saw a figure approaching. It was a woman, dressed in a long, dark cloak, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. She moved with a grace and agility that belied her age, her steps silent and purposeful. It was Agnes. Margaret and Henry exchanged a quick glance, their hearts pounding in unison. This was it, the moment of truth. They emerged from the shadows, their movements slow and deliberate, their hands concealed beneath their cloaks. They approached Agnes, their voices calm and measured, their words carefully chosen. "Agnes?" Henry said, his voice a low murmur. "We've been expecting you." Agnes stopped, her body tense, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. She studied them carefully, her gaze piercing and insightful.
"Who are you?"
she asked, her voice sharp and commanding.
"What do you want?"
Margaret stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "We're friends, Agnes. We know about your work. We want to help." Agnes remained wary, her hand hovering near a concealed pocket, likely where she kept a weapon. She didn't trust them, and they couldn't blame her. "We know about Elise," Henry added, his voice dropping to a whisper. "We know about Klaus." Agnes's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. She hadn't expected them to know those names, those secrets. "What do you know?" she asked, her voice softer now, her guard slightly lowered. Margaret and Henry began to weave their fabricated story, a tale of shared sympathies, of a desire to help the German cause, of a connection to Klaus's family. They spoke with conviction, their words carefully chosen, their emotions masked. Agnes listened intently, her expression unreadable. She was assessing them, weighing their words, trying to determine if they were genuine or if they were traps. The tension in the air was palpable, the silence broken only by the distant rumble of artillery fire and the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was a dance of deception, a game of cat and mouse, where one wrong move could have deadly consequences. Margaret, sensing an opportunity, decided to take a gamble. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the forget-me-not, the dried flower Henry had found in the trenches. She held it out to Agnes, her hand trembling slightly. "Klaus gave this to Elise," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "He wanted her to remember him." Agnes stared at the flower, her eyes widening in disbelief. She recognized it, of course. It was a symbol of their love, a token of their shared past. Her hand reached out, her fingers gently touching the delicate petals. A tear rolled down her cheek, a single tear of sorrow, of remembrance, of loss. "Elise," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You knew Elise?" Margaret nodded, her own eyes filling with tears. "We know her story, Agnes. We know about your connection." Agnes looked at them, her gaze searching, her expression a mixture of hope and despair. She saw the sincerity in their eyes, the genuine emotion that belied their fabricated story. She lowered her guard completely, her shoulders slumping, her body releasing the tension that had held it captive. "I am Elise," she said, her voice trembling. "Agnes was a disguise." The revelation struck Margaret and Henry like a physical blow. They had suspected it, of course, but to hear it confirmed, to see the truth revealed in the eyes of this woman, was overwhelming. Elise. She was here. Alive. After all this time, after all the searching, after all the doubt, they had found her. The stolen moments of their research, the stolen glances they'd shared confirming a hunch or discovery, had brought them here. To her. Chapter 14. The thin line between love and loss. The revelation that Agnes was Elise shattered the carefully constructed facade Margaret and Henry had built. The relief of finding her was immediately followed by a wave of complex emotions, joy, sorrow, disbelief, and a profound sense of connection to this woman who had endured so much. Elise, her face etched with the lines of hardship and loss, looked at them, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She had lived a double life for years, concealing her true identity, risking her life for a cause she believed in, haunted by the memory of the man she had loved and lost. How did you find me?" she asked, her voice trembling, her gaze searching their faces. Margaret and Henry recounted their story, the telegram, Klaus's letters, their search, their unwavering determination to uncover the truth. They spoke of their connection to Klaus, the feeling that his spirit had somehow guided them, led them to her. Elise listened intently, her expression shifting between wonder and disbelief. She had long given up hope of ever being reunited with anyone who knew Klaus, anyone who understood the depth of their love, the tragedy of their separation. "He spoke of you often," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "In his letters he mentioned a Margaret a nurse and a Henry a soldier. He dreamed of you both, of a future where you could all be together." The words sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. Klaus's connection to them, across time and space, across the boundaries of life and death, was undeniable. It was a testament to the enduring power of love, a force that transcended even the most brutal of realities. They spend the next few hours in the crumbling church, sharing their stories, their sorrows, their hopes. Elise recounted her life since Klaus's death, her involvement in the spy network, her unwavering commitment to helping those affected by the war, her constant fear of discovery. She explained that she had adopted the name Agnes as a disguise, a way to protect herself and her network from exposure. She had lived a life of constant danger, of secrecy and deception, always looking over her shoulder, always fearing the consequences of her actions. Margaret and Henry listened, their hearts aching for her, for the sacrifices she had made, for the loneliness she had endured. They realized that they had stumbled upon a story far more complex, far more profound than they could have ever imagined. As the night wore on, the conversation shifted to the present, to the immediate dangers they faced. Elise revealed that she was planning to flee the country, to escape the tightening grip of British intelligence, to seek refuge in a neutral territory. She had been betrayed, she explained, by someone within her own network, someone she had trusted implicitly. She didn't know who the traitor was, but she knew that her time was running out. Margaret and Henry exchanged a quick glance, their minds racing. They knew that they had to help her, that they couldn't abandon her to her fate. They had come too far, risked too much, to let her be captured or killed. "We'll help you escape, Elise," Henry said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with determination. "We'll get you out of here." Elise looked at them, her expression a mixture of gratitude and apprehension.
"It's too dangerous," she said.
"I can't ask you to risk your lives for me. We're already risking our lives." "Elise," Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm. "We're in this together. We made a promise to Klaus, and we intend to keep it." They devised a plan, a daring and risky escape route that would take them through enemy lines, across the war-torn landscape, to the safety of the coast. They knew that the chances of success were slim, that they could be captured or killed at any moment. But they were prepared to take the risk. They were bound together by a shared purpose, a shared love, a shared commitment to honoring the memory of Klaus and Elise, to defying the brutal forces of war. As dawn approached, they prepared to leave the church, their hearts pounding in their chests, their minds racing with anticipation and fear. They were walking a thin line between love and loss, between hope and despair, between life and death. And they knew that their journey had just begun. The war raged on, but they were no longer just soldiers and nurses, caught in the machinery of conflict. They were guardians of a love story, protectors of a legacy, their own lives intertwined with the fate of a woman they had come to cherish. Chapter 15. A Revelation in the Rain. The escape from the church was a harrowing ordeal, a blur of hurried movements, whispered instructions, and constant vigilance. The rain began to fall as they slipped through the back entrance, a cold, relentless downpour that mirrored the turmoil in their hearts. The mud sucked at their boots, the wind whipped at their cloaks, and the darkness seemed to press in on them, a suffocating presence. Henry led the way, his soldiers' instincts guiding them through the treacherous terrain. Margaret followed close behind, supporting Elise, who was weakened by years of stress and hardship. They moved silently, like shadows, avoiding roads and open fields, sticking to the cover of trees and hedgerows. The rain intensified, soaking them to the bone, chilling them to the core. They pressed on, their bodies aching, their minds numb, their determination fueled by adrenaline and a shared sense of purpose. They reached a small, deserted farmhouse, a temporary refuge from the storm. Henry forced open a window, and they slipped inside, collapsing on the dusty floor, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They huddled together, shivering, their clothes clinging to their skin. Henry lit a small fire in the hearth, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, providing a small measure of warmth and comfort. Elise looked at them, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Margaret and Henry exchanged a quick glance, their hearts filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had made it this far, but they knew that the most dangerous part of their journey still lay ahead. As they waited for the rain to subside, They talked, sharing stories, their voices low and intimate. Elise spoke of her life with Klaus, of their brief but passionate romance, of the dreams they had shared, of the heartbreak of their separation. She revealed details that Margaret and Henry had only glimpsed in Klaus's letters, the intimate moments, the shared laughter, the unspoken promises. She painted a vivid picture of their love, a love that had defied distance, defied war, defied even death. As Elise spoke, Margaret noticed something familiar in her mannerisms, in the way she held her hands, in the tilt of her head, in the inflection of her voice. It was a subtle resemblance, a fleeting echo of someone she knew, someone she loved. She looked at Henry, her eyes widening in realization. He saw it too. He nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of wonder and disbelief. "Elise," Margaret said, her voice hesitant, her heart pounding in her chest. "Your maiden name, what was it?" Elise looked at her, her brow furrowed in confusion. "My maiden name? It was Hayes. Elise Hayes." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth.
Hayes.
It was her own surname, her own family name. My grandfather," Margaret stammered. He had a sister. She disappeared. Years ago. We never knew what happened to her." Elise stared at her, her eyes widening in shock. "Your grandfather? You mean we're related?" Margaret nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I think we are. I think you're my aunt." The revelation hung in the air, a moment of profound connection, a twist of fate that defied all logic and reason. They were family, connected by blood, connected by love, connected by the shared legacy of Klaus. The rain continued to fall outside, a relentless rhythm against the roof of the farmhouse. But inside, in the flickering firelight, a new warmth had bloomed, a sense of belonging, a sense of coming home. They embraced, their bodies clinging together, their tears mingling. It was a moment of profound joy, of unexpected reunion, of a family found amidst the chaos and destruction of war. The revelation in the rain washed away the years of separation, the layers of disguise, the shadows of betrayal. It revealed a truth that had been hidden, a connection that had endured, a love that had transcended time and space. They were family, bound together by a shared history, a shared sorrow, and a shared hope for the future. Chapter 16. The Cost of Courage. The discovery of their familial connection deepened the bond between Margaret, Henry, and Elise, strengthening their resolve to escape the clutches of war and reach safety. The rain eventually subsided, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air fresh and crisp. But the dangers they faced remained, heightened by the knowledge that they were not just protecting a stranger, but a member of their own family. They set off again, their movements cautious and deliberate, their senses on high alert. Henry, with his military experience, charted a course through the treacherous landscape, avoiding enemy patrols and checkpoints. Margaret, with her medical skills, tended to Elise's needs, ensuring she had the strength to continue. As they journeyed, Elise revealed more about her involvement in the spy network, the risks she had taken, the sacrifices she had made. She spoke of the network of contacts she had cultivated, the coded messages she had transmitted, the lives she had saved. She also spoke of the betrayal that had forced her to flee, the unknown traitor within her own ranks who had exposed her to British intelligence. She suspected someone close, someone she had trusted, but she had no proof, no way to identify the culprit. The weight of this betrayal hung heavily over her, a constant reminder of the dangers she faced, the precariousness of her situation. She knew that she could trust no one, that her every move could be watched, her every word reported. As they neared the coast, the landscape became increasingly desolate, the signs of war more evident. They passed through ruined villages, saw abandoned trenches, encountered groups of refugees fleeing the fighting. They reached a small, isolated fishing village, their planned point of departure. Henry had arranged for a contact, a fisherman who was sympathetic to their cause, to smuggle them across the channel to neutral territory. But as they approached the village, they sensed something was wrong. The streets were deserted, the houses empty, the fishing boats gone. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of unease. They cautiously entered the village, their weapons drawn, their eyes scanning the surroundings. They found the fisherman's house, the door ajar, the interior ransacked. There was no sign of the fisherman, no indication of what had happened to him. They were ambushed. Suddenly, soldiers emerged from the shadows, their rifles aimed, their faces grim. They were British soldiers, members of a special intelligence unit tasked with capturing Agnes, the notorious spy. Margaret, Henry, and Elise were surrounded, trapped, their escape route cut off. They had been betrayed, their plans compromised, their hopes dashed. Agnes, the commanding officer said, his voice cold and hard. Or should I say, Elise Hayes? You are under arrest for espionage and treason. Elise stood tall, her head held high, her eyes defiant. She knew that this was the end, that her luck had finally run out. I am Elise Hayes, she said, her voice clear and strong. And I am not ashamed of what I have done. The soldiers moved to arrest her, their movements swift and efficient. But before they could reach her, Henry stepped forward, his rifle raised, his face a mask of fury. Leave her alone, he shouted, his voice echoing through the deserted streets. She's done nothing wrong. The soldiers hesitated, their eyes shifting between Henry and their commanding officer. They were not expecting resistance, not from a fellow soldier. The commanding officer, a seasoned veteran with a ruthless reputation, stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Henry. Stand down, soldier, he said, his voice dangerously low. This is not your fight. She's family, Henry retorted, his voice unwavering. And I won't let you take her. A tense standoff ensued, the air thick with the threat of violence. Margaret watched, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She knew that Henry was prepared to die for Elise, for their family, for their love. She stepped forward, placing herself between Henry and the soldiers, her voice calm but firm. There's been a mistake, she said, addressing the commanding officer. Elise is not a spy. She's a victim. She's been helping people, saving lives. The commanding officer scoffed, his expression dismissive. She's a traitor, nurse. And you're aiding and abetting her. You'll both be court-martialed. Margaret knew that arguing was futile, that the officer was determined to carry out his orders. She looked at Henry, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. She knew what he was going to do, and she knew that she couldn't stop him. Henry lowered his rifle slightly, his gaze locked on Margaret's. He smiled, a sad, tender smile that spoke volumes. He was making a choice, a sacrifice, a testament to his love. He turned and fired his rifle, not at the soldiers, but at a nearby stack of oil drums. The drums exploded in a fiery blast, creating a diversion, a wall of flames that separated them from the soldiers.
Run,
Henry shouted, pushing Margaret and Elise towards the cover of a nearby building. Get out of here.
go.
Margaret and Elise hesitated, their eyes filled with horror. They didn't want to leave him, to abandon him to his fate.
Go.
Henry yelled again, his voice desperate. I'll hold them off. Just go. He turned and faced the soldiers, his rifle blazing, his body a shield against the oncoming attack. He was buying them time, sacrificing himself to give them a chance to escape. Margaret and Elise, their hearts breaking, their tears streaming down their faces, obeyed. They ran, their legs pumping, their lungs burning, their minds numb with grief and terror. They ran for their lives, leaving Henry behind, leaving him to face the consequences of his courage, his love, his ultimate sacrifice. The cost of courage was high, the price of love immeasurable. They ran, carrying his memory, his love, his spirit within them, their hearts forever scarred by the loss of a hero. Chapter 17. Where the Heart Lies. The escape from the village was a desperate flight, a blur of fear and adrenaline. Margaret and Elise, their hearts shattered by Henry's sacrifice, ran blindly through the darkness, the sounds of gunfire and shouts echoing behind them. They didn't know where they were going, only that they had to get away, to escape the clutches of the soldiers who were pursuing them. They stumbled through fields, scrambled over fences, waded through streams, their bodies aching, their lungs burning, their minds numb with grief and terror. They were driven by a primal instinct to survive, to honor Henry's sacrifice, to reach safety. They eventually found refuge in a small, abandoned shepherd's hut, hidden deep in the woods. They collapsed on the earthen floor, their bodies trembling, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They huddled together, seeking comfort in each other's presence, their tears mingling, their hearts aching with loss. They had lost Henry, the man they both loved, the man who had given his life to save them. He's gone, isn't he? Elise whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Margaret nodded, unable to speak, her throat constricted with grief. She couldn't bear to say the words, to acknowledge the reality of their loss. They remained in the hut for hours, their silence broken only by their sobs and the rustling of the wind in the trees. They were lost, adrift in a sea of sorrow, their future uncertain, their hope extinguished. As dawn approached, a glimmer of resolve began to flicker within Margaret. She knew that they couldn't stay here, that they had to keep moving, that they had to honor Henry's sacrifice by surviving, by finding a way to live. "We have to go, Elise," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. "We have to keep moving. We have to find a way to safety." Elise looked at her, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen, her face pale and drawn. She nodded slowly, her expression a mixture of resignation and determination. They emerged from the hut, their bodies stiff and sore, their hearts heavy with grief. They looked back at the village, now shrouded in the early morning mist, a silent testament to the tragedy that had unfolded there. They set off again, their direction uncertain, their path unknown. They were guided by instinct, by a shared determination to survive, by the memory of Henry's love. They walked for days, avoiding roads and towns, sticking to the cover of woods and fields. They scavenged for food, slept in barns and haystacks, their lives reduced to the basic necessities of survival. They encountered other refugees, fleeing the fighting, their faces etched with fear and despair. They shared their meager supplies, offered words of comfort, their shared suffering creating a bond of humanity in the midst of the inhumanity of war. As they journeyed, Margaret began to formulate a plan. She knew that they couldn't stay in France, that they were too close to the front lines, too vulnerable to capture. She decided that they would try to reach Switzerland, a neutral country, a haven of peace amidst the raging conflict. She shared her plan with Elise, her voice filled with a newfound determination. Elise agreed, her own spirit rekindled by Margaret's resolve. They changed their direction, heading south, towards the Swiss border. Their journey became even more arduous, the terrain more challenging, the dangers more acute. They crossed rivers, climbed mountains, navigated treacherous paths, their bodies pushed to the limits of endurance. They faced hunger, thirst, exhaustion, and the constant threat of discovery. But they persevered, their determination fueled by their love for Henry, their commitment to each other, their unwavering belief in a future beyond the war. They were two women, bound together by loss, by love, by a shared destiny. They were walking towards a new life, a new beginning, a future where they could honor Henry's memory, where they could rebuild their lives, where they could find peace. Their hearts were heavy, their scars ran deep, but their spirits remained unbroken. They were survivors, carrying the torch of love and hope, their journey a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Where the heart lies, there is strength, there is resilience, there is the unwavering will to live. And their hearts, though broken, still beat strong, guiding them towards a future they could not yet see, but which they knew, with unwavering certainty, awaited them. Chapter 18. The Serpent in the Garden. The arduous trek to Switzerland tested Margaret and Elise's physical and emotional endurance. They faced countless obstacles, navigating treacherous terrain, evading patrols, and enduring hunger and exhaustion. Yet, with each hurdle overcome, their bond deepened, their shared grief and determination forging an unbreakable link between them. They finally reached the Swiss border, the site of the snow-capped Alps, a symbol of hope and refuge. They crossed the border illegally, under the cover of darkness, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and relief. They had made it. They were safe. They found shelter in a small village, their arrival met with a mixture of suspicion and compassion by the local community. They were refugees, strangers in a strange land, their past shrouded in secrecy, their future uncertain. They settled into a small, sparsely furnished cottage, their lives stripped down to the bare essentials. They found work, Margaret as a nurse in a local clinic, Elise as a seamstress, their skills providing a meager income, a means of survival. They began to rebuild their lives, slowly, painfully, their hearts still heavy with grief, their memories haunted by Henry's sacrifice. They found solace in each other's company, their shared loss creating a bond that transcended their familial connection. They spoke often of Henry, keeping his memory alive, their conversations a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. They remembered his courage, his love, his unwavering commitment to them both. As the months passed, a semblance of normalcy returned to their lives. They found a measure of peace in the tranquility of their surroundings, in the beauty of the mountains, in the kindness of the local people. But their past was not forgotten. The mystery of the betrayal that had led to Henry's death still lingered, a shadow that darkened their newfound peace. They knew that someone within Elise's spy network had betrayed them, but they didn't know who or why. One evening, as they sat by the fire, sharing a simple meal, Elise revealed a secret that she had kept hidden for years. She spoke of a coded message, a message that she had intercepted shortly before her escape from France. The message was from a high-ranking British intelligence officer, a man she had known and trusted, a man who had been a close friend of her family. The message revealed that he was the traitor, the one who had been feeding information to the Germans, the one who had betrayed her and Henry. Margaret listened, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She couldn't believe it. The man Elise described was a pillar of British society, a respected figure, a man beyond suspicion.
Why?
Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why would he betray you? Why would he betray his own country? Elise shook her head, her eyes filled with sorrow. I don't know, Margaret. I don't understand it. He was like a brother to me. I trusted him completely. She explained that the message had revealed the officer's motives, a complex web of personal ambition, financial gain, and a twisted sense of patriotism. He believed that the war was a mistake, that Britain should have allied with Germany, and he had been working secretly to undermine the Allied war effort. The revelation was a devastating blow, a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. It shattered their trust, their faith in humanity, their belief in the inherent goodness of people. Margaret and Elise knew that they had to do something, that they couldn't let this betrayal go unpunished. They had to expose the officer, to bring him to justice, to avenge Henry's death. They knew this meant danger. He was a man in a position of considerable power. But the serpent in their peaceful new garden had to be dealt with. They had to. For Henry, for Klaus, for their own sense of closure. They began to gather evidence, meticulously piecing together the fragments of information they had, their determination fueled by their grief, their anger, and their unwavering commitment to justice. It was a dangerous game, a deadly dance of secrets and lies, but they were prepared to play it. They were survivors, and they would not rest until the truth was revealed, until the serpent was exposed, until justice was served. Their peaceful sanctuary had been tainted, but they would not let it be destroyed. They would fight for their peace, for their future, for the memory of the man they had loved and lost. Chapter 19. Beyond the trenches, beyond the pain. The task of exposing the British intelligence officer, Sir Alistair Humphrey, was a daunting one. He was a man of immense power and influence, a figure beyond reproach, his reputation unblemished. Margaret and Elise knew that they needed irrefutable proof, evidence that could withstand scrutiny, that could not be dismissed as the ravings of two grieving women. They spent weeks meticulously gathering information, poring over Elise's old contacts, piecing together fragments of evidence, their movements cautious and deliberate. They knew that one wrong step, one misplaced trust, could expose them to danger, could jeopardize their entire operation. They discovered that Sir Alistair had been systematically feeding information to the Germans, providing them with details of Allied troop movements, supply routes, and strategic plans. He had used his position within British intelligence to access classified documents, to manipulate information, to sabotage the war effort. His motives were complex and convoluted, a mixture of personal ambition, financial greed, and a twisted ideology. He believed that a German victory was inevitable, and he had been positioning himself to profit from the outcome, to secure a position of power in a new, German-dominated world order. Margaret and Elise managed to obtain copies of coded messages, intercepted communications, and financial records that implicated Sir Alistair in the betrayal. They had enough evidence to expose him, to bring him to justice, to avenge Henry's death. But they knew that presenting this evidence to the authorities would be risky. Sir Alistair had powerful allies, influential friends who could protect him, who could discredit their claims, who could silence them permanently. They decided to take a different approach. They would leak the information to the press, to a trusted journalist who had a reputation for integrity and independence. They would expose Sir Alistair's treachery to the public, to force the authorities to act, to ensure that he could not escape justice. They arranged a clandestine meeting with a journalist, a man named David Thompson, who had been a vocal critic of the war, a champion of truth and accountability. They met in a secluded location, their identities concealed, their voices hushed. They presented Thompson with the evidence, the documents, the coded messages, the financial records. They told him their story, their connection to Elise, their loss of Henry, their unwavering determination to seek justice. Thompson listened intently, his expression shifting between disbelief and outrage. He examined the evidence carefully, his journalist's instincts kicking in, his mind racing with the implications of their discovery. He agreed to help them, to publish their story, to expose Sir Alistair's treachery to the world. He knew that he was taking a risk, that he could face retaliation, that his career, even his life, could be in danger. But he was a man of principle, a believer in truth, and he could not stand idly by while a traitor operated with impunity. The story broke like a thunderclap, shaking the foundations of British society. The public was outraged, the press was in a frenzy, the authorities were forced to act. Sir Alistair was arrested, his reputation shattered, his life in ruins. The trial was a media sensation, a spectacle of intrigue and betrayal. Margaret and Elise testified, their voices clear and strong, their evidence irrefutable. They faced intense scrutiny, their pasts dissected, their motives questioned, but they stood firm, their determination unwavering. Sir Alistair was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. Justice was served, Henry's death was avenged, the serpent in the garden had been vanquished. For Margaret and Elise it was over. The trenches were behind them, the immediate, sharp pain behind them, but the scars remained, a constant reminder of the sacrifices they had made, the losses they had endured. They had found justice, they had found closure, but they could never fully escape the shadows of the past. They had found each other, they had rebuilt their lives, but they could never forget the man they had loved and lost. They had moved beyond the trenches, beyond the pain, but their journey was far from over. They would carry Henry's memory with them, their love for him a beacon guiding them towards a future they could not yet see, but which they knew, with unwavering certainty, they would face together. Chapter 20. The Reckoning. The aftermath of Sir Alistair's trial left Margaret and Elise emotionally drained, yet strangely liberated. The weight of secrecy, the burden of seeking justice, had been lifted. They had faced their demons, confronted their past, and emerged victorious, albeit scarred. They decided to remain in Switzerland, their adopted home, the place where they had found refuge, where they had rebuilt their lives, where they had finally found a measure of peace. They had grown to love the tranquility of the mountains, the kindness of the local people, the sense of community that had embraced them. Margaret continued her work as a nurse, her skills and compassion bringing comfort to those in need. She found solace in helping others, in easing their suffering, in making a difference in their lives. She had found her purpose, her calling, a way to channel her grief into something positive, something meaningful. Elise, her health gradually improving, dedicated herself to creating a memorial for Henry, a tangible tribute to his courage, his love, his sacrifice. She designed a beautiful garden, a sanctuary of peace and remembrance, filled with flowers, trees, and a small stone monument bearing Henry's name and the inscription, "He gave his life so that others might live." The garden became a place of pilgrimage, a destination for those who had known Henry, for those who had been touched by his story, for those who sought solace and inspiration. It was a place of healing, a place of remembrance, a place of hope. Margaret and Elise spent hours in the garden, tending to the flowers, sharing memories of Henry, their conversations a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. They had found a way to keep his spirit alive, to honor his memory, to celebrate his life. One day, as they were working in the garden, a young man approached them. He was dressed in a soldier's uniform, his face familiar, his eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. He introduced himself as Sergeant Miller, the man who had been with Henry in the trenches, the man who had witnessed his final act of courage. He had learned of Margaret and Elise's story, of their connection to Henry, of their efforts to expose Sir Alistair's treachery. He had come to pay his respects, to thank them for their courage, to share his memories of Henry. He spoke of Henry's bravery, his leadership, his unwavering commitment to his men. He spoke of the day Henry had sacrificed himself, the day he had saved Margaret and Elise's lives. He was a hero, Sergeant Miller said, his voice choked with emotion. He was the best of us. He deserved to be remembered. Margaret and Elise listened, their hearts filled with a mixture of sorrow and pride. They were grateful for Sergeant Miller's words, for his confirmation of Henry's heroism, for his shared grief. They invited him to stay with them, to share their home, to become part of their family. He accepted, his presence a comforting reminder of Henry, a link to their past, a symbol of hope for the future. Life continued, its rhythm slow and deliberate, its moments filled with a quiet joy, a profound sense of peace. Margaret and Elise had found solace in each other's company, in their shared memories, in their commitment to honoring Henry's legacy. They had paid their dues. There had been a full reckoning of love, of duty. They had emerged from the darkness of war, from the shadows of betrayal, from the depths of grief, stronger, wiser, more compassionate. They had learned the true meaning of love, the true cost of courage, the true value of life. They had found their way back to each other, back to themselves, back to a future filled with hope and possibility. They had reckoned with their past, and they were ready to embrace their future, together. Epilogue. Years passed, the seasons turning, the scars of war slowly fading, the memories of love and loss lingering like a bittersweet melody. Margaret and Elise remained in Switzerland, their lives intertwined, their bond unbreakable. Sergeant Miller became a permanent member of their household, a surrogate brother, a constant source of support and companionship. The garden, Henry's garden, flourished, a testament to the enduring power of love, a symbol of hope and resilience. It became a place of pilgrimage, not just for those who had known Henry, but for anyone seeking solace, inspiration, or a moment of quiet contemplation. Margaret continued her work as a nurse, her gentle touch and compassionate heart bringing comfort to countless patients. She never forgot Henry, his memory a guiding light, his love a constant presence in her life. She found a measure of peace in her work, in her dedication to helping others, in her commitment to making a difference in the world. Elise, her health fully restored, devoted her time to the garden, to writing, and to supporting various charitable causes. She became a voice for peace, a champion of human rights, an advocate for those who had been marginalized and forgotten. She used her experiences, her suffering, her resilience, to inspire others, to promote understanding, to build a better world. They often spoke of Henry, sharing stories, reminiscing about their time together, their voices filled with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. They kept his memory alive, not just in their hearts, but in their actions, in their commitment to living a life worthy of his sacrifice. One sunny afternoon, as they sat in the garden, surrounded by the vibrant colors and fragrant scents of the flowers, Margaret turned to Elise, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, her voice soft, "about the telegram? About Klaus? About the connection?" Elise smiled, a knowing smile, a smile that spoke of wisdom and acceptance. "I do," she said. "But I no longer seek answers. I no longer question the mysteries of life. I have learned to embrace them, to trust in the unseen forces that shape our destinies." Margaret nodded, her own heart filled with a sense of peace. She, too, had come to accept the inexplicable, to believe in the power of love to transcend time and space, to connect us in ways we may never fully understand. They sat in silence for a moment, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with gratitude. They had lived through a war. They had faced unimaginable losses. They had endured unspeakable pain. But they had survived. They had found each other. They had built a new life. They had found peace. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, carrying the scent of roses and lavender. Margaret and Elise looked at each other, their eyes filled with a love that had endured the test of time, a love that had transcended the boundaries of life and death, a love that would last forever. They had found their way home, to each other, to themselves, to a future filled with hope and possibility. The telegram, the war, the pain, the loss, it had all led them here, to this moment, to this peace. And they knew, with unwavering certainty, that they were exactly where